Welcome to Boring History at Sleep. Before we begin the full story tonight, I want to give you something rare: the entire 600-year story of the Ottoman Empire told in 4 minutes. Think of it as a map before a long journey. After this, we go deep, but first, the shape of the whole thing. It begins in the year 1299 in a small corner of northwestern Anatolia, what is now Turkey. A tribal chieftain named Osman leads a band of perhaps a few hundred warriors. Nobody is watching. Nobody thinks this matters. The great powers of the era, the Mongols, the Byzantines, the Seljuk Turks, are all far larger and far more impressive. Osman is a footnote, or so it seems. Within 1 generation, his son Orhan has taken the first Byzantine city. Within 2 generations, the Ottomans have crossed into Europe. Within a century, they have an empire spanning 2 continents. And in 1453, 154 years after Osman's small beginning, his descendant Mehmed II rides a white horse through the gates of Constantinople, the most magnificent city in the Christian world, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which had survived for over 1,000 years, ends in a single afternoon. Then the empire keeps growing. Selim the Grim conquers Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina in just 8 years. Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest of all Ottoman sultans, rules for 46 years, pushes to the gates of Vienna, controls the Mediterranean, and builds an empire so large it takes months to cross. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire stretches from Hungary in the northwest to Yemen in the southeast, from Algeria in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east. 300 million people, 3 continents, 600 years. And then, slowly, painfully, over 2 centuries, it falls apart. Military defeats, economic stagnation, nationalist revolts from Greece to Bulgaria to Arabia, the sick man of Europe, the great powers call it. World War I delivers the final blow. The empire enters the war on the losing side. It loses. The Sultanate is abolished in 1922, the Caliphate in 1924. The last Sultan sails away from Constantinople on a British warship. The empire is gone, but the world it shaped, the borders, the religions, the languages, the architecture, the food, the conflicts, all of that remains. Tonight, we tell the whole story. Let us begin. To understand the Ottoman Empire, we first need to understand the world into which it was born, a world of extraordinary chaos and extraordinary opportunity. The late 13th century in Anatolia and the Near East was a landscape of collapsing powers and shifting frontiers, and into that landscape a small Turkish tribal group stepped at exactly the right moment. The great Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century had shattered the established order of the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic heart of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries, based in the magnificent city of Baghdad, had been destroyed in 1258 when the Mongol general Hulagu Khan sacked the city, killed the caliph, and reportedly filled the Tigris River with the ink of scholars' books and the blood of their authors. It was one of the most catastrophic cultural destructions in human history. The Islamic world was in shock. In Anatolia itself, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had controlled most of the peninsula for 2 centuries, had been broken by the Mongols at the Battle of Köse Dağ in 1243 and reduced to a vassal state.
As Seljuk power crumbled, Anatolia fragmented into dozens of small principalities called beyliks, each ruled by a Turkish warrior chieftain competing for land, resources, and followers. On the western edge of this fragmented landscape sat the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, once the most powerful Christian state in the world, now a shadow of its former self. Constantinople still gleamed with its ancient walls and magnificent churches, but the empire it ruled had shrunk dramatically. The Byzantines controlled parts of northwestern Anatolia, Constantinople itself, and scattered territories in the Balkans. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and militarily exhausted, a tempting target for any ambitious neighbor. And into this world, the broken Islamic East, the fragmented Turkish beyliks, the weakened Byzantine frontier, stepped a man named Ertugrul and his son Osman. They led one of the smallest and least significant of the Anatolian beyliks, settled in the region around Suut, near the Byzantine border. They had perhaps a few thousand warriors. They had ambition, and they had a border with Byzantium, which meant they had a direction to grow.
Osman Bey, the man whose name gives the empire its name, the Ottoman Empire being the empire of the House of Osman, is one of history's most important figures and one of its least documented. He ruled from approximately 1299 to 1326, and almost everything we know about him comes from later Ottoman historical tradition, written generations after his death and filtered through layers of legend and political purpose. What we can say with confidence is this: Osman transformed a small tribal frontier principality into a growing state with a distinct identity, a loyal following, and an expansionist momentum that would not be stopped for 2 centuries after his death. He did this through a combination of military skill, political shrewdness, and an extraordinary ability to attract followers across ethnic and religious lines. Osman's principality sat on the Byzantine frontier, which was both dangerous and enormously advantageous. Frontier regions attract a particular type of person: warriors seeking glory and plunder, refugees from more settled areas seeking new beginnings, religious volunteers called Ghazis, who believed that fighting against non-Muslims on the frontier was a sacred duty rewarded by God. Osman welcomed them all. His army was religiously diverse and ethnically mixed from the very beginning, which gave it both manpower and flexibility. The famous dream of Osman, preserved in Ottoman tradition, tells of a vision in which a great tree grows from his chest, its branches covering the world, and its roots reaching the great rivers of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Whether or not Osman actually had this dream, the story captures the Ottoman self-image perfectly: a divinely ordained expansion from a small seed to a world-spanning tree. Ottoman historians would cite this dream for centuries as proof that their empire was destined by God. Osman's first major military success came with the capture of Bursa in 1326, a prosperous Byzantine city that became the first Ottoman capital. Osman himself reportedly died just before or just after the city fell. He was buried there, and his tomb in Bursa remains a pilgrimage site to this day. His son Orhan continued the work and accelerated it dramatically. Orhan, Osman's son and successor, ruled from approximately 1326 to 1362 and transformed what his father had built from a successful raiding chieftaincy into something recognizably a state.
He created institutions, a regular army, an administrative structure, a coinage. He built mosques and schools in the cities he took. He was no longer just a warrior chieftain, he was a ruler. The fall of Nicaea, ancient Iznik, one of the most historically significant cities in the Christian world, site of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where the Nicene Creed was formulated, came in 1331. The fall of Nicomedia followed in 1337. Byzantine Anatolia was collapsing with startling speed. The Ottomans were not just raiding anymore, they were absorbing territory, settling it, administering it. Then something happened that changed the entire trajectory of Ottoman history. The Ottomans crossed into Europe. In 1354, an earthquake destroyed the walls of the Byzantine fortress of Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles. Ottoman forces crossed the strait and occupied the ruined city before the Byzantines could rebuild. For the first time, Ottoman boots were on European soil. They would remain on European soil for the next 5.5 centuries. The crossing into Europe was not just a military event, it was a psychological and strategic revolution. The Ottoman Empire was now a European power as well as an Asian one. The Balkans, a region of great agricultural wealth, dense population, and strategic importance, lay open, and the Byzantine Empire, which had survived 1,000 years by playing its neighbors against each other, now found itself squeezed from both sides. Orhan also made a political alliance that would define Ottoman strategy for generations. He cultivated relations with Byzantine factions, even marrying a Byzantine princess named Theodora. This willingness to ally with, intermarry with, and absorb non-Muslim elites was a hallmark of early Ottoman statecraft. The Ottomans were not interested in a simple religious war of extermination. They were interested in power, and power came from incorporation, not just destruction.
Murad I, who ruled from 1362 to 1389, was the Sultan who truly made the Ottoman Empire a Balkan power. Under his reign, Ottoman armies swept through Thrace, Bulgaria, and into Serbia, moving with a speed and effectiveness that stunned European observers who had barely registered the Ottomans as a serious threat until it was too late. Adrianople, modern Edirne, fell in 1369 and became the new Ottoman capital, a deliberate statement that the empire's center of gravity was shifting westward into Europe. Sofia fell. Monastir fell. The Ottomans were at the gates of Hungary and reaching toward the Adriatic coast. The Serbian Empire, which had been the dominant Balkan power under Tsar Stefan Dusan just a generation earlier, was fragmenting under the pressure. Murad also created one of the Ottoman Empire's most distinctive and controversial institutions, the devshirme, or child levy. Periodically, Ottoman administrators would travel through the Christian villages of the Balkans and select the most intelligent, physically impressive young boys, typically between 8 and 18 years old, and take them from their families to be raised as Muslims and trained for Ottoman state service. These boys would become the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps of the Ottoman army, and the most capable among them would rise to become viziers, generals, and governors. The grand viziers who administered the empire at its height were overwhelmingly devshirme men. The system was brutal by modern standards. Children were taken from their parents, their religion was changed, their identity was remade. But within the Ottoman system, it was also a genuine pathway to extraordinary power.
A Christian peasant boy from Bulgaria or Serbia, taken through the Devshirme, could rise to command armies and govern provinces. Many did. The system produced some of the most capable administrators and soldiers the empire ever had. Murad I died at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the great confrontation between a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, and Albanian lords and the Ottoman army. The battle's outcome is still debated, but both sides suffered enormous losses, and Murad himself was killed, reportedly stabbed by a Serbian nobleman named Miloš Obilić, who had pretended to defect. Kosovo entered Serbian national mythology as a moment of sacred sacrifice, a wound in the national memory that would reopen 6 centuries later with terrible consequences. Bayezid I, called Yildirim, the thunderbolt for the speed of his military movements, inherited the empire at Kosovo and immediately demonstrated why he had earned his nickname. He strangled his brother Yakub on the battlefield to prevent any succession dispute, a practice that would become a grim Ottoman tradition, and then launched a decade of aggressive expansion that nearly tripled the empire's territory. Bayezid completed the absorption of the remaining Anatolian Turkish beyliks, bringing the entire peninsula under Ottoman control. He besieged Constantinople for years, tightening the noose so effectively that the Byzantine emperor was reduced to begging the courts of Europe for help. He crushed a massive Western European crusade at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1996, an army of French, Hungarian, Venetian, and other Christian forces that had assembled with great fanfare and been destroyed with humiliating efficiency. But Bayezid was also arrogant. His rapid conquests and his lifestyle, reportedly dissolute, surrounded by wine and women in ways that scandalized more traditional Muslims, had made enemies. And then, from the east, came a force that made the Ottomans look like beginners. Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, the Central Asian conqueror who built pyramids of skulls outside the cities he destroyed, and whose army had already crushed the Delhi Sultanate, sacked Baghdad, and devastated the Mamluks of Egypt. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, Timur met Bayezid, and it was a catastrophe. The Ottoman army was shattered. Bayezid himself was captured, the first and only Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner by an enemy. He died in Mongol captivity months later, reportedly kept in a cage, though later Ottoman historians disputed this detail as too humiliating to accept. The Ottoman Empire seemed finished. Timur reinstalled the old Anatolian beyliks, returned their lands, and left. The Ottoman princes fell into a decade-long civil war over succession, the Ottoman interregnum of 1402 to 1413. 4 sons fought for the throne. One by one they were eliminated until Mehmed I emerged victorious and began the painstaking work of putting the empire back together. The Ottomans were down, they were not out.
The recovery of the Ottoman Empire from the Timurid catastrophe is one of history's most remarkable institutional comebacks. Mehmed I, ruling from 1413 to 1421, spent his entire reign rebuilding, suppressing rebellions, reclaiming lost territories, restoring the administrative structures that civil war had broken. He was not a conqueror, he was a healer, and the empire needed healing badly. His son, Murad II, who ruled from 1421 to 1451 with one brief interruption, continued the restoration and added new conquests. Murad was a complex man, deeply religious, genuinely interested in culture and learning, but also a formidable military commander when circumstances required.
He defeated a major European crusade at the Battle of Varna in 1444, where the Hungarian commander János Hunyadi and the Polish-Hungarian king Vladislav III led a Christian coalition against the Ottomans and were decisively broken. Vladislav was killed in the battle, his head preserved in honey and sent to Bursa as a trophy. Murad famously abdicated in 1444, handing power to his 12-year-old son Mehmed and retiring to a life of contemplation and study in Manisa. It did not last. The Janissary Corps, the professional infantry that was becoming the most powerful institution in the Ottoman military, revolted. European powers launched new military campaigns. Murad was called back from retirement and resumed the throne. He would not make the same mistake again. The cultural life of Murad's court was extraordinary. He patronized poets and scholars, corresponded with learned men across the Islamic world, and oversaw the translation of Persian and Arabic literary classics into Turkish. The Ottoman court was becoming not just a military headquarters, but a genuine center of Islamic civilization, something the early sultans, focused on raiding and expansion, had not particularly cultivated. When Murad died in 1451, he left his son an empire that was restored, strengthened, and poised for its greatest single act. The young Mehmed, who had already shown flashes of brilliance and ruthlessness during his brief first reign, was now in power for good. He was 19 years old, and he had one obsession that had consumed him since childhood: Constantinople. May 29, 1453 is one of the most significant dates in world history. On that day, the Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire of Augustus and Constantine, which had survived for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire, came to an end. And it ended at the hands of a 21-year-old sultan who had spent years preparing for this single moment. Mehmed II was unlike any sultan before him. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He read voraciously, collected books, corresponded with learned men across the Islamic world, and oversaw the translation of Persian and Arabic literary classics into Turkish. The Ottoman court was becoming not just a military headquarters, but a genuine center of Islamic civilization, something the early sultans, focused on raiding and expansion, had not particularly cultivated. When Murad died in 1451, he left his son an empire that was restored, strengthened, and poised for its greatest single act. The young Mehmed, who had already shown flashes of brilliance and ruthlessness during his brief first reign, was now in power for good. He was 19 years old, and he had one obsession that had consumed him since childhood: Constantinople. May 29, 1453 is one of the most significant dates in world history. On that day, the Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire of Augustus and Constantine, which had survived for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire, came to an end. And it ended at the hands of a 21-year-old sultan who had spent years preparing for this single moment. Mehmed II was unlike any sultan before him. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He read voraciously, collected books, corresponded with learned men across the Islamic world, and oversaw the translation of Persian and Arabic literary classics into Turkish. The Ottoman court was becoming not just a military headquarters, but a genuine center of Islamic civilization, something the early sultans, focused on raiding and expansion, had not particularly cultivated. When Murad died in 1451, he left his son an empire that was restored, strengthened, and poised for its greatest single act. The young Mehmed, who had already shown flashes of brilliance and ruthlessness during his brief first reign, was now in power for good. He was 19 years old, and he had one obsession that had consumed him since childhood: Constantinople. May 29, 1453 is one of the most significant dates in world history. On that day, the Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire of Augustus and Constantine, which had survived for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire, came to an end. And it ended at the hands of a 21-year-old sultan who had spent years preparing for this single moment. Mehmed II was unlike any sultan before him. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He read voraciously, collected books, corresponded with learned men across the Islamic world, and oversaw the translation of Persian and Arabic literary classics into Turkish. The Ottoman court was becoming not just a military headquarters, but a genuine center of Islamic civilization, something the early sultans, focused on raiding and expansion, had not particularly cultivated. When Murad died in 1451, he left his son an empire that was restored, strengthened, and poised for its greatest single act. The young Mehmed, who had already shown flashes of brilliance and ruthlessness during his brief first reign, was now in power for good. He was 19 years old, and he had one obsession that had consumed him since childhood: Constantinople.
Mehmed understood immediately that taking Constantinople was not enough. He had to make it the capital of something worthy of its name. The city had been depopulated by decades of siege and decline. He began a massive resettlement program, bringing in Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire and beyond. He invited merchants from Genoa and Venice, the commercial powers of the Mediterranean, to settle and trade. He rebuilt churches, mosques, and synagogues. Within a generation, Constantinople, now called Istanbul in common usage, though the Ottomans continued to use the old name officially, was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Mehmed's conquests after Constantinople were equally impressive. He absorbed the remaining Byzantine successor states. The Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast fell in 1461. He conquered Serbia, Bosnia, most of Greece, Albania, against fierce resistance from the Albanian chieftain Skanderbeg, who held the Ottomans off for decades and became a Christian hero across Europe. He invaded Italy, briefly capturing the port of Otranto in 1480, a moment that sent genuine panic through the Italian states and the papacy, who feared that Rome itself might fall as Constantinople had. Mehmed reorganized the entire administrative structure of the empire. He created the institution of the Grand Vizier as the Sultan's chief minister and effective head of government, allowing the Sultan to withdraw from day-to-day administration and focus on the larger picture of imperial policy. He codified Ottoman law in a series of qanunnameh, law codes that regulated everything from taxation to court protocol to the penalties for various crimes. He also institutionalized fratricide. The Ottoman succession law, if it can be called a law, held that when a new sultan came to power, he should have all his brothers strangled with a silk cord to prevent succession disputes. The cord was silk rather than rope because royal blood should not be shed. This brutal practice was Mehmed's rationalization for the violence that had consumed Ottoman succession from the very beginning.
better to kill your brothers immediately than to allow years of civil war that would cost thousands more lives. It was a logic that later sultans would follow with appalling consistency. Before we follow the story of conquest and expansion further, let us pause and understand what the Ottoman Empire actually was as a governing system, because it was one of the most sophisticated and unusual political structures in world history. At the top was the Sultan, absolute ruler in theory, but in practice constrained by Islamic law, by the opinions of the religious establishment, by the Janissary Corps, and by the competing interests of the great households of the imperial elite. The Sultan's power was real, but not unlimited, and sultans who ignored these constraints tended to be deposed or assassinated. The Ottoman system was explicitly multi-religious, not in the modern liberal sense of equal rights for all, but in the older sense of organized religious communities managing their own internal affairs. The millet system, from the Arabic word for nation or community, gave each recognized religious community the right to govern itself in matters of personal law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, religious practice. The Greek Orthodox community, the Armenian community, the Jewish community, each had their own leaders recognized by the Ottoman state, their own courts, their own schools. In exchange for paying their taxes and not causing political trouble, non-Muslim subjects of the empire were left largely alone in matters of religion and personal life. This system was not equality. Non-Muslims paid a special tax called the jizya. They faced restrictions on building new religious structures, on riding horses, on wearing certain colors. They could not serve in the Ottoman army as regular soldiers, though they could and did serve in other capacities. But compared to the treatment of religious minorities in contemporary Western Europe, where Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, where Protestants and Catholics slaughtered each other in the wars of religion, where the Inquisition burned heretics, the Ottoman millet system was remarkably tolerant. When Spain expelled its Jews in 1492, the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II, reportedly said, "They call Ferdinand a wise king, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched ours." The economy of the empire was built on agriculture, trade, and conquest. The great trade routes of the ancient world, the Silk Road, the spice routes from Asia to Europe, the grain routes of the Black Sea, all passed through or near Ottoman territory. Control of these routes gave the empire enormous revenue. The famous spice trade between Europe and Asia, which had for centuries flowed through Ottoman and earlier Islamic lands, was one of the great economic engines of the medieval and early modern world.
Selim I, called Yavuz in Turkish, meaning the stern or the grim, reigned for only 8 years, from 1512 to 1520. In those 8 years, he roughly doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire, crushed the two most powerful Islamic states of his era, secured the holy cities of Islam for the Ottoman dynasty, and transformed the Ottomans from a Balkan Anatolian power into the dominant force in the entire Muslim world. No sultan before or after accomplished so much in so little time. Selim came to power through force, deposing his own father, Bayezid II, who abdicated under pressure and died shortly after, possibly poisoned. He then had his brothers and their sons killed to secure the succession. The blood price of Ottoman power was always paid in family. His first great campaign was against the Safavid Empire of Persia, a new power that had emerged in Iran under Shah Ismail, who had made Shia Islam the state religion and was actively proselytizing among Ottoman subjects in eastern Anatolia, threatening the empire's religious and political cohesion. Selim's response was brutal even by the standards of the era. He ordered the killing of tens of thousands of Shia Muslims within Ottoman territory before marching east. At the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, Ottoman guns and disciplined infantry destroyed the Safavid cavalry army, despite being outnumbered. Selim captured Tabriz, the Safavid capital, briefly. Then he turned south. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, the great Arab power that had stopped the Mongols, controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Hijaz, with the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, fell in just 2 years. The Battle of Marj Dabik in 1516 and the Battle of Ridanya in 1517 effectively destroyed Mamluk military power. Selim entered Cairo as conqueror. He took the last Abbasid Caliph, a shadow figure maintained by the Mamluks for ceremonial purposes, to Constantinople, and with him the symbols of the Caliphate. Whether Selim formally claimed the Caliphate is disputed by historians. The Ottoman claim to the Caliphate was not strongly emphasized until centuries later. But the practical reality was clear. The Ottoman Sultan now controlled the 2 holiest cities in Islam. He was the servant of the 2 holy mosques. The religious prestige this gave the dynasty was incalculable. When Suleiman came to the throne in 1520, he inherited the most powerful empire in the world. What he built on that inheritance over the next 46 years made his name synonymous with imperial greatness in the European imagination, and with justice and wisdom in the Ottoman one. In Turkey, he is called Suleiman Kanuni, Suleiman the lawgiver, because his greatest achievement was not conquest, but the systematic codification of Ottoman law and administration. In Europe, he was called the Magnificent, because the sheer scale and splendor of his empire and court dazzled every European who encountered them. He was 26 when he became Sultan, well-educated, serious, and possessed of an unusual combination of military aggression and administrative patience. His first campaign captured Belgrade in 1521, the key fortress that had blocked Ottoman advance into Hungary. His second campaign, in 1522, took the island of Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller, the crusading military order that had been based there for 2 centuries and had been a constant thorn in the Ottoman side, raiding Ottoman shipping and sheltering Christian pirates. Then came Hungary. At the Battle of Mohács in 1526, Suleiman's army destroyed the Hungarian kingdom in a single 2-hour engagement. King Louis II of Hungary was killed, fleeing the battlefield. His horse lost its footing in a marsh, and Louis drowned, reportedly in less than a meter of water. The Hungarian nobility was decimated. The kingdom fell. Within 3 years, Ottoman forces were camped before the walls of Vienna, the first Ottoman siege of Vienna, in 1529. Vienna held. The siege failed, partly because Suleiman's massive army had outrun its supply lines, partly because the rains turned the ground to mud that made deploying his artillery impossible, partly because the city's defenders fought with desperate determination. Suleiman withdrew and would return, but that first siege of Vienna marked the high watermark of Ottoman advance into the European heartland. They would never get further west.
At sea, Suleiman's admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, a former pirate who had given his fleet and his allegiance to the Ottomans, dominated the Mediterranean with terrifying effectiveness, raiding the Italian and Spanish coasts, defeating Habsburg naval forces, and transforming the Ottoman Empire into the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean world.
The domestic achievements of Suleiman's reign were as remarkable as his military campaigns. The legal reforms he oversaw, reorganizing and rationalizing the enormous body of secular Qanun law that had accumulated over generations, created a coherent legal system that balanced Islamic Sharia with Ottoman administrative practice. His code regulated everything: the duties of judges, the rights of peasants, the organization of guilds, the conduct of trade, the treatment of minorities. It was the most comprehensive Ottoman legal codification ever produced. The physical expression of Suleiman's glory was architecture. His chief architect, Mimar Sinan, one of the greatest architects in history, who designed over 300 structures during his long career, transformed the Ottoman landscape. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1558, is Sinan's masterpiece and one of the finest buildings ever constructed. 4 minarets, a dome that rivals the Hagia Sophia, set on a hilltop commanding the entire city, its interior a luminous, perfectly proportioned space that seems to hold light rather than merely admit it. Suleiman's court was a world of extraordinary sophistication. Persian poetry, Ottoman music, miniature painting, calligraphy, all flourished under his patronage. The Ottoman miniature tradition produced images of breathtaking delicacy. The art of marbled paper, Ebru, was elevated to a high art form. The ceramics of Iznik, white and cobalt blue tiles of extraordinary beauty that decorated the great mosques, were produced in quantities that filled palaces and tombs across the empire. At the center of the court was the harem, not the lurid fantasy of Western imagination, but a complex, hierarchically organized household that was simultaneously a domestic establishment, a political institution, and an educational system for the empire's future rulers. The most powerful woman in the harem was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who wielded real political influence and often served as a crucial stabilizing force when sultans were young, absent, or incompetent. Suleiman's own relationship with his favorite concubine, Hürrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, was one of the most remarkable royal relationships of the 16th century. He freed her, married her legally, breaking all Ottoman precedent since sultans did not marry their concubines, gave her unprecedented political influence, and was visibly, publicly devoted to her until her death. Their correspondence, preserved in the Ottoman archives, is tender and passionate. She bore him sons and shaped the succession in ways that would ultimately tear his court apart. The shadow side of Suleiman's glorious reign was the destruction of his own family, a tragedy orchestrated in significant part by Hürrem Sultan and her ally, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, and consented to by Suleiman himself in moments of jealousy and political fear. Suleiman had an eldest son, Mustafa, by an earlier concubine, a young man of exceptional ability and enormous popularity, beloved by the Janissaries and widely seen as the obvious heir. Mustafa was everything a crown prince should be: educated, brave, charismatic, experienced in military command. The Janissaries openly preferred him to Hürrem's sons. Hürrem and Rustem worked systematically to destroy him.
They planted evidence or manufactured rumors that Mustafa was planning to rebel against his father and seize the throne prematurely. In 1553, during a military campaign, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. Mustafa came, because to refuse would have been an admission of guilt. He was strangled by mutes inside the tent while his father reportedly watched from behind a curtain. The reaction across the empire was grief and fury. Soldiers wept openly. Poems mourned the lost prince. The Grand Vizier Rustem, widely blamed, was briefly dismissed, but the deed was done. Mustafa was gone. The field was clear for Hürrem's sons, but she herself died in 1558 before the succession was resolved, and what followed was a brutal civil war between her surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid, in which Bayezid was defeated and fled to Persia, where he was eventually killed, at Ottoman request, with Persian compliance, by a Persian executioner. Suleiman died in 1666 on campaign in Hungary, besieging the small fortress of Sigedvar. He was 72 years old, and so ill that his death was concealed from the army for weeks while the campaign continued to prevent demoralization. His body was transported back to Istanbul in secret. He had reigned for 46 years and built the Ottoman Empire to its greatest height. What came after could not quite match what he had created.
The period roughly from the death of Suleiman in 1566 to the accession of Murad IV in 1623 is known by Ottoman historians as the Sultanate of Women, a remarkable era in which the real political power in the empire was exercised not by the sultans themselves, but by the women of the imperial harem, particularly the Valid sultans and their allies among the harem women and the bureaucratic elite. This period came about through a combination of factors. The sultans who followed Suleiman were, with some exceptions, less capable and less engaged than their predecessors. The old practice of princes being sent to govern provinces, gaining administrative and military experience before inheriting, was abandoned. Instead, princes were confined to the palace in a gilded cage called the kafes, or cage, where they lived under constant surveillance, unable to develop experience, contacts, or political skills. When they came to the throne, they were often unprepared, psychologically damaged, and dependent on the experienced politicians around them, who were, very often, their mothers. Nurbanu Sultan, the Venetian-born favorite of Selim II and mother of Murad III, was the first great Valid Sultan of this era, a woman of formidable intelligence who corresponded directly with the Doge of Venice and effectively ran Ottoman foreign policy during the early years of her son's reign. Safiya Sultan, the Albanian favorite of Murad III and mother of Mehmed III, was equally powerful, maintaining an extensive diplomatic correspondence with Queen Elizabeth I of England, two powerful women at opposite ends of Europe, trading letters and gifts across the continent. Kosem Sultan, the Greek-born favorite of Ahmed I and mother of two sultans, Murad IV and Ibrahim, was perhaps the most powerful of all the Valid sultans. She effectively ruled the empire for periods totaling nearly 2 decades, managing the bureaucracy, controlling appointments, and navigating the deadly politics of the imperial court with extraordinary skill. She was finally strangled in 1651 by the supporters of her daughter-in-law Turhan Sultan in one of the most dramatic palace coups of Ottoman history. The women's sultanate has been dismissed by some historians as a period of decline, weak sultans, court intrigue, loss of direction. But the empire during this period still functioned, still expanded in some directions, still maintained its administrative structures. The women who ran it were not incompetent,
They were, in many cases, more capable than the sultans they served. The real problem was structural. A system that confined its future rulers in cages could not produce great sultans on demand. Selim II, Suleiman's surviving son, the one who won the civil war against his brother Bayezid, reigned from 1566 to 1574. History has not been kind to him. He's remembered primarily by his nickname, Selim the Sot, on the basis of a reportedly heavy fondness for wine, and by the catastrophic naval defeat at Lepanto in 1571, the first major Ottoman military defeat in over a century. The Battle of Lepanto deserves both its fame and some qualification. In October 1571, a Holy League assembled by Pope Pius V, combining Spanish, Venetian, Genoese, and other Catholic naval forces under the command of Don John of Austria, met the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras off the coast of Greece. The battle was the largest naval engagement in the Mediterranean since antiquity, involving over 400 galleys and perhaps 150,000 men. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed, over 200 ships sunk or captured, tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers killed or taken prisoner, and roughly 12,000 Christian galley slaves freed from Ottoman ships. The shock in Europe was enormous, not because of the practical consequences, which were actually limited, but because it proved that the Ottomans could be defeated at sea. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was cracked. Lepanto became the most celebrated Christian military victory of the 16th century, inspiring paintings, poems, and celebrations across Europe. Cervantes, who was wounded in the battle and lost the use of his left hand, later called it the greatest occasion that past and present ages have seen or future ones can hope to see. But within a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet, something that astonished their European opponents. The Turk, a Venetian official reportedly said, can grow a new fleet as easily as a tree grows new branches. Can we do the same? The Ottoman reconquest of Tunis in 1574 demonstrated that the empire's Mediterranean power was intact. Lepanto had been a wound, not a death blow. The lesson Europe took was somewhat misleading. The Ottomans were vulnerable at sea. The lesson the Ottomans took was more accurate. They needed better naval technology.
No institution shaped Ottoman history more profoundly or caused more problems than the Janissary Corps. Understanding the Janissaries is essential to understanding why the Ottoman Empire both succeeded so brilliantly for so long and struggled so painfully to reform itself in its later centuries. At their founding under Murad I, the Janissaries were a revolutionary military innovation. They were full-time professional soldiers in an era when most armies were feudal levies raised for specific campaigns and disbanded afterward. They trained constantly. They were organized, disciplined, and supremely effective. They were paid regularly from the imperial treasury. They were absolutely forbidden to marry or engage in trade. They were soldiers and only soldiers with no divided loyalties. For 2 centuries, the Janissaries were the cutting edge of Ottoman military power. It was the Janissaries who held the breach at Constantinople in 1453. It was the Janissaries who destroyed the Mamluk cavalry at Marj Dabik. It was the Janissaries whose disciplined fire decided battle after battle across 3 continents. They were the most effective standing army in the world. But over time, the institution rotted from within. The prohibition on marriage was relaxed, then abandoned. Janissaries were permitted to engage in trade. Their sons were admitted to the corps, destroying the Devshirme system's logic of an army with no family loyalties. The corps grew enormously in size while declining in military effectiveness.
What had been an elite fighting force became a privileged hereditary caste, economically powerful, politically dangerous, and increasingly resistant to any reform that threatened their privileges. Janissary revolts became a recurring feature of Ottoman political life. When a sultan displeased the Janissaries by failing to pay their bonuses, by attempting reforms they opposed, by promoting rivals, they overturned their soup cauldrons in a palace courtyard, a symbolic act that meant rebellion. Several sultans were deposed by Janissary revolts. Ibrahim the Mad was strangled, partly with Janissary support. The core that had built the empire became one of the empire's greatest obstacles to survival. It would take a massacre, the auspicious incident of 1826, to finally destroy them. We have spent much of this story with sultans, viziers, and battles. Let us now descend to the level of ordinary life in the Ottoman Empire. The peasants and merchants, the craftsmen and scholars, the pilgrims and travelers who made up the vast majority of the empire's population. The Ottoman city was organized around two great institutions, the mosque complex and the bazaar. The mosque complex, the kuliye, was not just a place of worship, but a social institution. A major mosque would be surrounded by a medrese, or religious school, a hospital, a soup kitchen feeding the poor, a caravanserai housing travelers, a library, public fountains. The mosque complex was the welfare state of the Ottoman city, funded by religious endowments called waqf that operated independently of the state. The Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, Kapalı Çarşı, the covered market, was perhaps the greatest commercial space in the world during the empire's height. Built in the 15th century and continuously expanded, it eventually covered 61 covered streets and 4,000 shops, trading in everything from spices to silk to jewelry to livestock. It was not merely a market, but a city within a city with its own mosques, fountains, police force, and regulations. Merchants from Venice, Persia, India, and Egypt, and every corner of the empire rubbed shoulders in its covered lanes. Coffee, introduced to Istanbul in the mid-16th century from Yemen, transformed Ottoman social life with remarkable speed. Coffee houses became the social centers of Ottoman cities, places where men gathered to drink coffee, play backgammon and chess, listen to storytellers and musicians, argue about politics and religion. The ulema, the religious scholars, repeatedly complained that coffee houses were dens of sedition and immorality. Sultan Murad IV banned coffee and tobacco and reportedly had people found drinking them executed. None of it worked. Coffee was too popular, too social, too essential. The Ottoman coffee house was eventually exported to Europe, where it became the English coffee house, the French café, and ultimately the modern café culture of the world. The Ottoman pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, was one of the great organizational achievements of the empire. Every year, enormous caravans assembled at Damascus and Cairo, funded and protected by the Ottoman state, carrying tens of thousands of pilgrims across the Arabian desert. The Sultan's role as protector of the holy cities and guarantor of the safe pilgrimage was central to his religious legitimacy. The infrastructure built to support the Hajj, watering stations, caravanserais, fortified rest houses across the desert, was one of the largest public works programs in the medieval and early modern world. Murad IV, who ruled from 1623 to 1640, was the last sultan to personally lead his armies on major campaigns and the last to achieve significant conquest. He was also one of the most violent rulers in Ottoman history, combining genuine military talent with a ruthlessness that bordered on sadism. He came to the throne at the age of 11 during one of the most chaotic periods in Ottoman history. The Janissaries were out of control. They had recently killed the young Sultan Osman II after he had attempted to reform and limit their power. The state finances were in disarray. Anatolian rebellions, called the Selali revolts, had been devastating the countryside for decades. Iran had taken Baghdad. The empire was in crisis. Murad spent his first years of personal rule. He did not effectively control the government until his late teens, reasserting royal authority by the most direct means available: execution. He reportedly had hundreds of thousands of people killed during his reign, including senior officials who displeased him. He personally strangled people. He had a man executed for smoking tobacco in his presence, and reportedly patrolled Istanbul at night in disguise, executing anyone he found violating his prohibitions on alcohol, tobacco, and coffee. But he was also militarily brilliant. His reconquest of Baghdad from the Safavids in 1638, after a siege of almost 40 days, was one of the Ottoman greatest military achievements of the 16th century. He led the campaign personally, fighting in the front lines. The fall of Baghdad was celebrated across the Ottoman world and led directly to the Peace of Zuhab. Murad died of illness in 1640 at the age of 27, reportedly still drinking heavily despite his prohibitions on others. He left no surviving sons. His brother, Ibrahim, kept in the kafes for years, reportedly driven half-mad by the experience, inherited the throne. Ibrahim's reign would be one of the strangest and most disastrous in Ottoman history.
Ibrahim I, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad, though the diagnosis of madness is somewhat unfair to a man whose psychological damage was entirely explicable given his circumstances, ruled from 1640 to 1648. He had spent years in the kafes, expecting to be executed at any moment. When his brother Murad died and he was finally told he was Sultan, he reportedly refused to believe it and had to be physically dragged to the throne. Ibrahim's reign was characterized by erratic decision-making, enormous expenditure on his harem, and the political dominance of his mother, Kosem Sultan, and a succession of favorites who manipulated him for their own purposes. Stories of his eccentricities, demanding that his harem be furnished entirely in sable fur, reportedly ordering the drowning of hundreds of his concubines after a jealous rage, may be exaggerated by hostile sources, but the basic picture of an unstable, easily manipulated ruler is consistent across multiple accounts. He was deposed in 1648 and strangled shortly afterward, with, it was said, the reluctant agreement of his mother, Kosem, who calculated that his son Mehmet would be easier to manage than Ibrahim himself. It was an extraordinary act, a mother consenting to the execution of her own son. The Ottoman succession was always brutal. His son, Mehmet IV, came to the throne as a child and ruled nominally for decades, while real power was exercised by a series of grand viziers, most notably the remarkable Kopruli family, whose members served as grand vizier across 3 generations and genuinely revitalized Ottoman administration and military capacity in the second half of the 17th century. The second great Ottoman siege of Vienna came in 1683 under the Grand Vizierate of Kara Mustafa Pasha, commanding an army of perhaps 150,000 men. The siege terrified Europe. Vienna was nearly taken. But on September 12, 1683, a relief army led by the Polish king Jan III Sobieski descended from the Kahlenberg Hill overlooking Vienna in the largest cavalry charge in history, 20,000 horsemen sweeping down the slope into the Ottoman flank. The Ottoman army collapsed and fled.
Kara Mustafa retreated to Belgrade, where he was executed by Ottoman order, strangled with the customary silk cord, his head sent back to Istanbul in a velvet bag. The failed Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 marks the traditional beginning of Ottoman decline, though, like all historical turning points, the reality is more complex than the symbol. The Ottoman Empire did not suddenly become weak in 1683. It had been losing ground on certain fronts for decades. What 1683 changed was the psychological and strategic momentum. From that point forward, the Ottomans were on the defensive in Europe. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was the first great Ottoman territorial retreat. After a series of devastating defeats at the hands of the Habsburg Empire, Venice, Poland, and Russia, a grand alliance that the failure at Vienna had catalyzed, the Ottomans ceded Hungary, Transylvania, most of Slavonia, and the Peloponnese. For the first time in Ottoman history, substantial territory that had been part of the empire was surrendered by treaty. It was a shock to Ottoman political culture, which had always assumed that territory once taken was held forever. Peter the Great of Russia was now pressing on the northern Black Sea coast. The Habsburgs were pushing in Hungary. The Venetians, briefly, held parts of Greece. The empire was contracting on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the reforms needed to reverse the trend were blocked by the same institutional inertia: the conservative religious establishment, the janissaries, and the great household interests that had accumulated power during the empire's long success. The occasional brilliant sultan or grand vizier could reverse the trend temporarily. Mustafa II won back some territory. Ahmed III, during the Tulip era, a period of cultural flourishing and relative peace in the early 18th century, presided over a court of extraordinary artistic productivity while the empire breathed and tried to reform. But the underlying structural problems were not solved. The military technology gap with Europe was growing. The economic model was under strain. The empire needed fundamental change, and fundamental change was exactly what its most powerful institutions existed to prevent.
The reign of Ahmed III, from 1703 to 1730, included a period so distinctive that it has its own name in Ottoman history, the Lale Devri, the Tulip era. It was a brief, brilliant interlude of peace, cultural flowering, and the first serious Ottoman engagement with European ideas and technology, and it ended, like so many Ottoman reforms, in violent reaction. The Tulip era is named for the extraordinary Ottoman obsession with tulips that flourished during this period. Tulip cultivation became a court craze. Thousands of varieties were developed. Tulip gardens were built across Istanbul, and a single rare bulb could command a price equivalent to a laborer's annual wages. The tulip had always been an Ottoman flower. It was the Ottomans who had introduced it to Europe in the 16th century, where it triggered its own famous tulip mania in the Netherlands. But the tulip era elevated it to an art form and a symbol. More significant than flowers was the cultural opening. Ahmed's Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, established the first Ottoman printing press in 1727, using Arabic script to produce books in Turkish and Arabic rather than European languages. The press was a major step, though the religious establishment insisted it not print religious texts, limiting its scope. French fashions appeared at court. Ottoman intellectuals began studying European military science and engineering. An embassy was sent to Paris,
the first serious Ottoman diplomatic mission to France, and its reports on Versailles, French gardens, and European court life circulated widely among the Ottoman elite. The Patrona Halil Revolt of 1730 ended the tulip era abruptly. Patrona Halil, a former Albanian sailor turned street merchant and religious agitator, led a popular uprising against the perceived decadence, westernization, and corruption of the court. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, was killed. Ahmed III abdicated. The Tumut Gardens were destroyed. The printing press was shut down for years. The pattern repeated itself across Ottoman history: reform, reaction, setback. Each time, the window closed a little faster than it had opened. The 19th century brought a new and ultimately unstoppable threat to the Ottoman Empire: nationalism. The idea that people sharing a language, a culture, and a history constituted a natural political community entitled to self-governance was a product of the French Revolution and the Romantic movement, and it spread through the Ottoman Empire's Christian populations like a slow fire that could not be extinguished. The Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821, was the first great national revolt against Ottoman rule to succeed, and its success was a template and an inspiration for every subsequent nationalist movement in the Balkans and beyond. Greece had been under Ottoman rule for nearly 4 centuries. The Greek Orthodox Church had maintained Greek cultural and linguistic identity through the millet system. Greek merchants had grown wealthy in the Ottoman commercial system. Greek intellectuals, educated in Western Europe, had absorbed Enlightenment and Romantic nationalist ideas. The combination was explosive. The revolt began in the Danubian principalities, modern Romania, under a Greek nobleman named Alexander Ypsilantis, who had served as an officer in the Russian army and hoped for Russian support. It quickly spread to the Peloponnese, where Greek fighters massacred the Muslim and Jewish populations of several towns. The Ottomans responded with equal brutality, hanging the Patriarch of Constantinople, an elderly man who had nothing to do with the revolt, from the gates of his own church on Easter Sunday. The war lasted years. The Ottomans, with Egyptian military assistance, seemed close to suppressing it, but European public opinion was inflamed. The cause of Greek independence resonated enormously with Western Europeans who had been educated on classical Greek literature and saw the modern Greeks as the heirs of Athens and Sparta. Lord Byron died in Greece fighting for Greek independence, becoming the most romantic martyr of the Romantic era. Eventually, Britain, France, and Russia intervened directly, destroying the Ottoman and Egyptian fleet at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. Greek independence was recognized in 1830. It was a relatively small territorial loss for the Ottoman Empire. Greece was a corner of the Balkans. But the principle was devastating. An Ottoman-ruled Christian people had revolted, gained European support, and achieved independence. Every other Christian people in the empire watched carefully and drew their own conclusions.
The First World War brought the Ottoman Empire to the final crisis of its existence, and within that crisis was committed one of the 20th century's defining atrocities, the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1916, in which somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenian Christians were killed through massacres, death marches, and deliberate starvation in what historians almost universally now recognize as a genocide, though the Turkish state continues to dispute this characterization. The context matters without excusing what happened.
The Ottoman Empire in early 1915 was fighting for its survival on multiple fronts. Russia was advancing in eastern Anatolia. The British and French were attacking at Gallipoli. The Ottoman Third Army had been catastrophically defeated by Russian forces at the Battle of Sarikamish in the winter of 1914 to 1915. In this context, the CUP leadership decided that the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia, who had their own nationalist organizations, some of whom had collaborated with Russian forces, represented an existential threat to the empire's rear. The decision was made to deport the entire Armenian population of Anatolia. What followed was not merely deportation. Deportation orders were accompanied by organized massacres carried out by the special organization, irregular forces specifically created for the purpose, and by Kurdish tribal groups. Armenians who survived the initial massacres were marched into the Syrian desert without food or water. The death toll was enormous. By any reasonable definition of the term, it was genocide, the deliberate destruction of a people as a people. The reverberations of the Armenian genocide extend to the present day. The question of its recognition, the Turkish state's denial versus the Armenian community's demand for acknowledgement, remains one of the most painful and divisive issues in Turkish-Armenian relations, in Turkish domestic politics, and in the foreign policies of countries with large Armenian diaspora populations. Over 30 countries have officially recognized it as genocide. Turkey has not, and the question remains bitterly contested. The other architects of the genocide, Talat Pasha, who was widely regarded as the primary organizer, were eventually tracked down and killed by Armenian assassins in Operation Nemesis, a coordinated campaign of revenge carried out in the early 1920s. Talat was shot in Berlin in 1921 by a survivor named Sogomon Tehlirian, who was acquitted by a German jury that heard testimony about the massacres. Justice of a sort was served. The dead were not brought back. While the Armenian deportations were beginning in the east, the most famous battle of the Ottoman First World War was being fought on the Gallipoli Peninsula, a campaign that was simultaneously an Ottoman military triumph, a British and Australian strategic disaster, and the founding myth of three modern nations. The Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles campaign, was Winston Churchill's great idea: force the Straits, take Constantinople, knock the Ottomans out of the war, open a supply route to Russia, and potentially win the war with a flanking maneuver that avoided the slaughter of the Western Front. The idea was not unreasonable. The execution was disastrous. British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and Indian forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915 and immediately ran into terrain that favored the defenders and an Ottoman defensive command of remarkable quality. Mustafa Kemal, a young Ottoman colonel who would later transform the wreckage of the empire into the Republic of Turkey, commanded the defense of the Chunik Bear Heights with an intensity that became legendary. His famous order to his men, "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come forward and take our places," captures both the desperation and the determination of the Ottoman defense. 8 months of fighting produced hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides and no strategic result. The Allied forces evacuated in December 1915 and January 1916, the evacuation being the most competently executed part of the entire campaign. The Ottoman defensive victory at Gallipoli was celebrated across the Muslim world as proof that the empire could still fight and win. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became the founding national trauma. April 25th, Anzac Day, is still the most sacred day in the Australian and New Zealand calendars, a day of national mourning and commemoration that has only grown in significance over the centuries since. The beach where Australian and New Zealand soldiers landed and died in enormous numbers is today called Anzac Cove. Kemal Ataturk's words of consolation to the Allied mothers who had lost sons at Gallipoli, written years later, are inscribed at memorials across Australia and New Zealand, words of extraordinary generosity from the commander who had defeated their sons.
While the Ottomans were fighting at Gallipoli, a new threat was developing in Arabia, one that would eventually contribute significantly to the empire's disintegration and that has shaped the modern Middle East in ways that are still unfolding today. The Arab Revolt of 1916 was launched by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the Ottoman-appointed guardian of the holy cities, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and a man who had been negotiating secretly with the British about the possibility of an Arab kingdom in exchange for rebellion against the Ottomans. The British, desperate to open new fronts against the Central Powers, promised Hussein that an independent Arab state would be established in the Arab lands if he revolted. This promise, simultaneously contradicted by the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement dividing the Arab lands between Britain and France, and by the Balfour Declaration promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, was one of the great acts of diplomatic bad faith in modern history. The Arab Revolt was militarily limited, but symbolically enormous. Arab tribesmen, advised by the British officer T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, harassed Ottoman supply lines and communications in the Hijaz and Syria. The Ottoman Empire, stretched thin across three fronts, could not effectively suppress it. Jerusalem fell to British forces under General Allenby in December 1917. The first Christian possession of Jerusalem since the Crusades, and a moment of enormous symbolic power. By 1918, the Ottoman military was collapsing. Bulgaria, the empire's European ally, collapsed first. The armistice was signed at Mudros on October 30, 1918. The three pashas fled to Germany on a German submarine. They would eventually be hunted down and killed. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces occupied Constantinople and much of Anatolia. The empire that had endured for 6 centuries was occupied, humiliated, and being divided among the victors. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 proposed the dismemberment of what remained of Ottoman Anatolia, giving eastern Anatolia to an Armenian state, a Kurdish autonomous region in the southeast, Greek control of Izmir and its hinterland, and direct European control of the Straits. For the Ottoman government and for Turkish nationalists, it was a death sentence. They refused to accept it. Out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire rose one of the 20th century's most remarkable figures, Mustafa Kemal, who would take the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, and who transformed an empire's wreckage into a modern republic in less than a decade through a combination of extraordinary military ability, political ruthlessness, and genuine visionary conviction. Kemal had been one of the Ottoman Empire's best military commanders, the hero of Gallipoli, the successful commander of various fronts during the war. When the war ended and the occupation began, he refused to accept the empire's defeat as final. In May 1919,
He landed at Samsun on the Black Sea coast as an inspector for the occupation authorities and immediately began organizing armed resistance to the Greek occupation of Izmir and the partition of Anatolia. The Turkish War of Independence from 1919 to 1923 was fought on multiple fronts against Greek forces who had landed at Izmir and were pushing inland, against Armenian forces in the east, against French forces in the south, and against the nominally Ottoman government in Constantinople that was cooperating with the occupiers. Kemal's forces won on all fronts. The Greek army, which had advanced deep into Anatolia, was decisively defeated at the Battle of the Sakarya in 1921 and then shattered at the Great Offensive of August 1922. The Greek army's retreat became a rout, ending in the burning of Izmir, a catastrophe that killed tens of thousands of Greek and Armenian civilians. The Lausanne Treaty of 1923 recognized the new Turkish state and its borders. It also provided for the largest population exchange in history up to that time. Approximately 1.2 million Greek Orthodox Christians were expelled from Anatolia to Greece, and approximately 400,000 Muslims were expelled from Greece to Turkey. Families that had lived in Anatolia for generations were uprooted. It was a traumatic, violent reshaping of the human geography of the Aegean world, and it produced the ethnically homogeneous Turkey that Ataturk's republic was built upon. The Sultanate was abolished in November 1922. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, sailed from Istanbul on a British warship, carrying with him whatever personal possessions he could take. 6 centuries of Ottoman rule ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with a quiet departure on a foreign ship. The caliphate lingered for 2 more years before being abolished in 1924. The Ottoman Empire was gone.
The Ottoman Empire's most immediate legacy is the map of the modern Middle East, a set of borders drawn by British and French diplomats in the aftermath of the First World War, with minimal regard for the ethnic, religious, and tribal realities of the populations living within them. These borders created Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Transjordan, states that have struggled with identity, legitimacy, and internal conflict ever since. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the secret British-French deal dividing the Arab world, created borders that cut across tribal and ethnic lines, put Sunni and Shia Muslims together in Iraq, where they had been kept in balance by Ottoman administrative structures, separated Kurdish populations across 4 countries, and gave Britain control of Palestine with its complex mixture of Arab Muslim, Arab Christian, and Jewish populations. The Palestinian conflict, the most enduring and painful of the modern Middle East's many conflicts, has its direct origins in the Ottoman era. Under Ottoman rule, Palestine's Arab Muslim majority, Arab Christian minority, and small Jewish population lived in a framework of Ottoman administration that, while unequal and often oppressive, maintained a rough coexistence. The collapse of that framework, the British Mandate period, and the establishment of Israel in 1948 created a conflict whose roots lie directly in the Ottoman dissolution. The Sunni-Shia tensions that define so much of contemporary Middle Eastern politics also have deep Ottoman-era roots. The Ottoman Empire was Sunni. The Safavid and then Qajar Iran was Shia. The borders between them,
drawn by the Peace of Zuhab in 1639, the Treaty of Erzurum in 1823, and later diplomatic negotiations, became the borders of the modern Middle East's great sectarian divide. Iraq, with its Shia majority and Sunni Kurdish minorities sitting astride the old Ottoman Safavid border, is the direct inheritor of this history. Turkey itself is perhaps the most direct and complex Ottoman legacy. The Turkish Republic that Ataturk built was explicitly a rejection of Ottoman imperialism, secular, nationalist, Western-oriented, built around a Turkish ethnic identity rather than an Islamic imperial one. Yet Turkey cannot escape its Ottoman past. Its architecture, its food, its music, its administrative traditions, and its geopolitical position are all Ottoman inheritances. The question of what Turkey is, a Western country, a Muslim country, an heir to empire, a secular republic, is the Ottoman question restated for the modern age. Before we close this story, we need to spend time with what the Ottoman Empire gave the world culturally, because the empire was not only a military and political phenomenon, but one of the great civilizational achievements of human history. Ottoman architecture is among the finest ever produced. Mimar Sinan's Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, which Sinan himself considered his masterpiece, greater even than the Suleymaniye, is a building of such geometric perfection and structural ingenuity that architects still study it. The 4 minarets are the tallest Ottoman minarets ever built. The central dome, slightly larger than that of the Hagia Sophia, is supported by 8 enormous pillars that free the walls for rows of windows, flooding the interior with light. Walking into the Selimiye is one of the great architectural experiences available to a human being. Ottoman miniature painting, developed in the palace workshops under the direction of masters like Nakash Osman, created a visual tradition of extraordinary delicacy and sophistication. Ottoman miniatures recorded historical events, illustrated manuscripts of poetry and history, and created a visual vocabulary of imperial power and divine order that was instantly recognizable across the Islamic world. The palace libraries at Topkapi contained thousands of illuminated manuscripts representing centuries of artistic production. Ottoman music, a tradition that synthesized Byzantine, Persian, and Central Asian elements into something entirely its own, was one of the richest musical traditions of the pre-modern world. Ottoman classical music used a system of modes called makam, each mode associated with particular emotional states, times of day, and seasons of extraordinary complexity and subtlety. Ottoman military music, performed by the Mekter bands, was so impressive that European composers, from Haydn to Mozart, wrote pieces in the Turkish style, the Alla Turca of Mozart's famous piano rondo being the most famous example. Ottoman cuisine has perhaps the most direct living legacy of all. The food traditions of the Ottoman palace kitchens, which employed hundreds of cooks and produced dishes for thousands of people daily, spread across the empire and became the foundation of modern Turkish, Greek, Lebanese, Syrian, Egyptian, and Balkan cooking traditions. Baklava, burek, pilaf, kebabs, dolmas, yogurt sauces, stuffed vegetables, rosewater desserts. These dishes, eaten from Istanbul to Cairo to Belgrade, are Ottoman inheritances that people eat every day without knowing their history. Coffee, as we mentioned earlier, was an Ottoman gift to the world. The Ottoman coffee house model, the place where men gathered to drink, socialize, debate, and be entertained, was exported to Europe in the 17th century and became the foundation of European café culture. The coffee house as a space of civil society where citizens meet as equals to discuss public affairs is an Ottoman invention that shaped the intellectual life of the Enlightenment.
How the Ottoman Empire is remembered today varies dramatically depending on where you are and who is remembering. There is no single Ottoman legacy. There are many, as varied as the peoples who lived under Ottoman rule. In Turkey, the Ottoman legacy is complicated and deeply political. Ataturk's republic was built on a conscious rejection of Ottoman imperialism and religious governance. For decades, the Ottoman past was treated with embarrassment, the empire as a symbol of backwardness, religious obscurantism, and national failure. But from the 1990s onward, and accelerating under the AKP governments of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, there has been a significant Ottoman revival in Turkish popular culture and politics. Television dramas like Diriliş Ertuğrul, which follows the life of Osman's father and has been watched by hundreds of millions of people across the Muslim world, present the early Ottoman story as a narrative of Muslim heroism, justice, and divine purpose. In the Arab world, the Ottoman legacy is predominantly negative. The Ottomans are remembered as foreign occupiers who extracted resources, suppressed Arab culture, and ultimately left behind a set of artificial borders that have caused a century of conflict. The Arab Revolt of 1916 and the promise of Arab independence are remembered. The failure of that promise, attributed in part to Ottoman rule having delayed Arab development, is a persistent theme. In Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and the other Balkan nations that emerged from Ottoman rule, the dominant narrative is one of oppression and liberation, the yoke of Ottoman rule, the heroic struggle for independence, the darkness before the national dawn. This narrative is not simply propaganda. Ottoman rule could be genuinely oppressive, and the tax burdens, the devshirme, and the zimmi status of non-Muslims were real grievances. But it also erases centuries of coexistence, cultural exchange, and relative tolerance that complicated a simple narrative of tyranny. The Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire had perhaps the most consistently positive memory. The Ottoman invitation to the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, "They call Ferdinand a wise king," was not mere rhetoric. The Sephardic Jewish communities of Istanbul, Salonika, Izmir, and elsewhere flourished under Ottoman rule for centuries, maintaining their culture, their language, and their religious practice. The destruction of these communities came not under the Ottomans, but under 20th century nationalism. Nazi occupation during World War II, population exchanges, emigration to Israel, and in the non-Arab Muslim world, in Pakistan, Indonesia, Central Asia, among Muslim minorities in Europe and North America, the Ottoman Caliphate is remembered with a nostalgia that increases with distance from the reality. The Ottoman Sultan Caliph as the last great sovereign of a unified Muslim world, whose fall left Islam without political protection in a hostile world, is a powerful myth that drives real political movements to this day. 600 years, 14 generations of sultans, an empire stretching across 3 continents. What explains the extraordinary longevity of the Ottoman state? The first answer is institutional flexibility. The Ottomans were remarkably willing to incorporate, adapt, and absorb. They took their administrative models from the Byzantines, their literary culture from the Persians, their legal framework from Islamic jurisprudence, their military technology from wherever they could find it. They employed Christian administrators, Greek bankers, Jewish physicians, Italian architects. The empire was an extraordinary synthesis, not a single culture imposed on others, but a layering of cultures in which each contributed something. The second answer is the millet system and the management of diversity. By formally recognizing religious communities and giving them internal autonomy, the Ottomans avoided the constant low-level conflict that plagued more religiously homogeneous states. Christian and Jewish subjects might resent their subordinate status, but they were not in constant existential conflict with the state. The system was stable enough to last centuries. The third answer is military effectiveness. For its first 3 centuries, the Ottoman army was simply better than its opponents, better organized, better equipped, better led. The Janissary infantry with firearms, the Ottoman artillery, the Sipahi cavalry, the imperial navy under commanders like Barbarossa, these were genuinely formidable forces that maintained Ottoman power through military superiority. When that superiority began to erode in the 17th and 18th centuries, the empire's problems began in earnest. The fourth answer is legitimacy. The Ottoman dynasty's claim to rule was multi-layered. They were Ghazi warriors fighting for Islam, heirs to the caliphate, protectors of the holy cities, representatives of divine will. This religious legitimacy gave the dynasty a resilience that purely secular dynasties lacked. Even when individual sultans were weak or incompetent, the dynasty itself retained a sacred quality that made rebellion against it religiously problematic for Muslim subjects. And the fifth answer is, perhaps, luck. The Ottomans faced existential threats multiple times: the Timuridic catastrophe of 1402, the Safavid Wars, the near defeat at Vienna, and survived each one through a combination of institutional resilience, individual leadership, and fortunate circumstances. History always contains an element of contingency. The Ottoman Empire might have ended in 1402. That it survived for another 5 centuries is not inevitable. It is remarkable.
We have traveled a very long way tonight. From Osman's small band of warriors in northwestern Anatolia in 1299, through the conquest of Constantinople and the golden age of Suleiman, through the slow decline and the desperate reforms and the catastrophe of the First World War, to the last sultan sailing away on a British warship in 1922. What does it mean? What can 600 years of Ottoman history tell us that is worth knowing beyond the facts themselves? It tells us something about the relationship between tolerance and power. The Ottomans, at their best, were remarkably tolerant of religious and cultural diversity. Not because they believed in equality, but because they understood that a diverse empire needed to accommodate diversity to survive. Tolerance was a strategic choice as much as a moral one. When the empire abandoned that strategic tolerance in the 19th and 20th centuries, under the pressure of nationalism and existential fear, it produced the Armenian genocide and the population exchanges that left a century of wounds. The lesson is not comfortable. Tolerance is easier to maintain when power is secure than when it is threatened. It tells us something about reform and resistance. Every Ottoman sultan who tried to modernize the empire faced the same coalition of opposition: the religious establishment that saw reform as a threat to Islamic law, the Janissaries who saw it as a threat to their privileges, the provincial elites who saw it as a threat to their autonomy. Reform was always possible in theory and always difficult in practice. The history of the Ottoman reform attempts, the Tanzimat, the Young Turks, Ataturk, is a history of how hard it is to change institutions that have embedded their interests in the structure of a state. And it tells us something about the persistence of history in the present. The borders of the modern Middle East are Ottoman borders. The Sunni-Shia conflicts of the present are Ottoman-era conflicts restated. The Palestinian question is an Ottoman inheritance. The relationship between Turkey and its neighbors, between Turkey and Europe,
Between the secular and religious traditions in Muslim-majority countries, all of these are Ottoman questions in modern dress. You cannot understand the modern Middle East without understanding the Ottoman Empire. You cannot understand modern Turkey without understanding what it chose to reject and what it could not escape. The Ottomans are not ancient history. They are last week's history in the long scale of civilizational time. Their world became our world. Their problems became our problems. And the 600 years of their extraordinary experiment in empire, building something larger and more durable than almost anyone before them, is a story worth knowing and worth remembering as we try to make sense of the world they left behind. And that, dear listeners, is the story of the Ottoman Empire, 600 years, from a small frontier chieftaincy in northwestern Anatolia in 1299, through the conquest of Constantinople and the golden age of Suleiman, through the slow decline and the desperate reforms and the catastrophe of the First World War, to the last Sultan sailing away on a British warship in 1922. We missed things, as we always do in stories this large. The full story of Ottoman architecture alone could fill several evenings. The story of the Ottoman Navy and the great admirals who made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake deserves its own telling. The lives of the ordinary people, the farmers of Anatolia, the merchants of Cairo, the scholars of Istanbul, the Christian craftsmen of Thessaloniki, are mostly invisible in the grand narrative of sultans and battles, and they deserve better. We did not fully explore the story of the Ottoman economy, how it shifted from a conquest economy to a trade economy, and struggled to make the transition to an industrial economy. We touched only briefly on Ottoman science and medicine, which were, in the 15th and 16th centuries, among the most advanced in the world before European science surpassed them. The story of how that happened, how the empire that was scientifically ahead fell behind, is its own fascinating and painful story. But I hope you leave tonight with the outline of the whole story in your mind. The tree from Osman's dream did grow as he saw it in his vision. It covered the world for 6 centuries. Its roots ran from the Danube to the Nile, from the Bosphorus to the Persian Gulf, and when it fell so heavily that the shape of its falling is still visible in every border, every conflict, every memory of the world it once ruled. This has been Boring History at Sleep. If you made it to the end of a story this long, you are exactly who we make this for. The history is long, the world that made us is old, and there is always more to know. Sweet dreams wherever you are tonight. We will have another story ready for you soon. Good night.